So every so often I know I'm like, oh, no. I know I've covered a subject like this or this subject many times, what I'm going to be bringing up, but I'm like, it seems like I have to it seems like my thinking on it maybe has advanced or it's different than before. I'm not sure if I remember it this way or that way. So I started thinking about this. To some degree, what's happening in dating for women, what they're seeing, the choices they're getting, this a part of this is it makes sense. You're not wrong. This is really, really weird because I started to think about what people posit with epigenetics, how Dutton has covered how quickly mutations can occur within human groups. There's even photos of the change in jaw lines from the Afghani hillsman who moves to England in the early 1900s to his grandchild, who's been raised in London, and the way that the jaw lines have softened fundamentally. Now, there's, people will have a lot of, we'd have to have a bit more evidence of, but they're getting into the whole thing of the drop in testosterone in men. And so one of the things I was thinking about was that at a certain point, there's a number of things that as long as they're admitted, they are what they are. And so people can decide where they want to be in relationship to this. Anyone who's studied occultist groups, that they're really going to come into this an abundance of all sorts of cool artistic material, really in the late 1800s and earliest 1900s, up till about the 1950s. You have all these great books, all this great art and kind of like spells and, the Golden Dawn Order and the Rosicrucians, the rites of the Rosicrucians and all these kinds of various things. And then there's sort of the corresponding books that were like what these, as reading groups, what these various organizations would be like. You should read this, like the Gothas of Pythagoras, the Golden Verses of Pythagoras. And so there was stuff like that I not sure what's happening here. Oh, okay. This sucks. Okay. All right. Okay. So you have like the Golden Verses of Pythagoras, and so I started to think about this, was that the occultist movement and the quote-unquote revolution, yeah, she was going to be sawing away there at the grass. So the occultist movement and the revolution and socialism and such like, these are things that are heavily tied together in the kind of elite part of society. These were big deal ideas that reading groups spread. There's some people who've done research on the quote-unquote Illuminati, and they point out how this phenomena called reading groups that popped up in France after, and they were supposedly modeled on something in Germany from earlier, and they would read these various books that were kind of verboten. But they were, like the Golden Verses of Pythagoras and such like. This would be for people who could afford such membership to such groups, things like that. I think reading circles might have been what they were actually called. But somebody traced how you see these pop up in the among the intelligentsia, and really kind of the upper, but this tier of power that has a lot of power, but not really. They're in no way really sovereign. They're not really free. they have a lot of power, but they're not really free. And it's just the nature of the way governments and everything ran at that time. And how at that time this is, still the ancien regime exists. And so these Freemasonic groups end up forming the backbone, and these various kinds of groups that some of them related to Freemasonry, but these also seem to be related much more closer to something out of the German tradition that that it came something out of the German tradition that had preceded it, with groups like the Illuminati and such. And so the Rosicrucian thing becomes then this big deal mythos that really, when people trace it, they trace that a lot of this has to do with these various ways that sort of control of political offices, legal offices, and universities, and what kind of groups of thinkers controlled these, and who were they loyal to, the Catholic Church or the burgeoning Protestant movement. And that's where you end up getting kind of this order of the rose and gold cross in Germany, and you get these just various or that in particular, that there's this movement of the Rosicrucians that's opposing something, and the Illuminati being one of them. Because the interesting idea with, and that, and it's a lot of this, it's like, yeah, but one of the things is that when you get an idea of the approach the Illuminati were taking, that the Rosicrucians were trying to do, a lot of what's associated with the Rosicrucians is kind of weird metaphysical ideas that are obviously based off of some interpretation of Kabbalism. Stuff from, and while that's, say, would be an aspect of instruction among, like, say, the Illuminati's degrees, would be instruction in the various kind of grammaticon and notaricon and things like that, and the structure of what would have been probably Lurianic Kabbalah. So a key thing that comes out of this is the interest in magical texts, magical papyri, the idea of, like, why was magic important, and then also the role of women in the revolution. And so this is, without there being this quote-unquote rebirth of the occult, you couldn't really have the feminist part of the revolution happen. They couldn't get women involved with Protestantism or Catholicism as sort of this cultural, they need something new. And so you find lots and lots of books and fascinating stuff on this, like Blavatsky, and especially if you're into the Rosicrucians, they were really way ahead on this kind of stuff, trying to constantly throw in new ideas from science into the revolution and into their idea of what alchemy was and what alchemy's true nature is, and that kind of thing. And so one of the things to get is, so this means that you needed something that had a different order. You needed something without the patriarchal God. You needed something without the Virgin Mary making a decision to save beings from endless sleep until the end of the universe, that they would actually rejoin God in theosis at the end of their life, and that this was a goal. And because this was a goal, there were certain aspects of the way one were to conduct themselves from that point on, and that this would then start a movement of breeding men for this purpose. So once people understand that Islam, by the time, you're looking at 730 something, and then from that point to 900, Islam had fundamentally expanded into Western Europe, all across Africa, and all the way out to China and the Philippines and Indonesia, conquering. They were at war with like the entire sort of known and unknown world at the time, for constantly. Most people don't really understand this, and so this, because people would then they produce different kinds of people. It's the model of virtue becomes very different when you have this sort of mystical conquest thing. And so that's why you find then with especially say the writings of a wide variety of sort of these people that are associated with the right, but they're kind of weird mystical people who want to merge mysticism and race with the state and things like that. You keep finding that they have a fascination with Islam, especially if they're Germans, because the Germans had the most advanced understanding of Islam up until still to this day. There's a whole huge library of amazing writing on Islam in German that it's like people are now rediscovering, because they had totally forgotten the relationship that Germany and Turkey had, and that Germany, everyone was supposed to forget. And that's kind of also an important part. When the quote-unquote colonial world, but when it was working for the Islamic world, there was stuff that came back from the Islamic world to America, such as belly dancing and other things that it was like, this is this cool part of the culture of that part of the world. So one of these would be stuff that came from Turkey, Turkish innovations. One of the things about that is that you end up getting what we in the Americas understand about Turkey and the Turkic peoples and such like. And so we end up, you'll find if you look in the past, like groups like the dervishes, nobody really gets really what they are. That this Sufi group, what are their beliefs, this, that, and the other, what are they associated with? Well, they're associated with being introduced to the West by German culture. That the group that we call the dervishes, their actual Bektashi Sufi group, we associate it really with, kind of like cool and artistic, this dance and this and that. When how we learned about it, how it got it, say in Germany, was Baron von Sabotendorf, who used it as the model for the organization known as the Thule. And there couldn't have been the revolution in Germany that we saw without some group that high muckety-muck people with lots of degrees and crazy ideas could meet and discuss something that they could then kind of wrap in this mysticism. And because nobody would know that much about the subject, they wouldn't know that much about Islam. They wouldn't know, but these also were very, 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 very smart and well-read men. These guys would be tying a lot of this stuff together in its own system of kind of political mysticism and race mysticism. A lot about the feminist movement, there's, like a lot of things on the left, there's been kind of this, okay, well, let's skip that. Let's not focus on that, because that's a little, out of context, ... But it's really something that it has to do with, you have to have a new order. And this new order doesn't have really a type of accountability for your morality. Unless the idea is that your morality is a morality that really has to do more with how you help the group. This is why the revolution and socialism and communism and feminism tie themselves so well together. And really people would argue that it's like, oh, well, no, you see, feminism is just an offshoot of Marxism. And so then when you get to Brie Folt's The Mothers, that's when you find a new addition to this argument. because of always this idea, oh, no, you see all of these goddess images from the past, and there's all the moon goddess, and it's the ancient way, and blah, 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 and magic, and the moon, and the vagina, and all this stuff. So, Briffault actually was a socialist that was trying to work out the whole lack of evolution itself in Marx's work, and because he would have been there prior, really, to the introduction of that as something that people were discussing widely. There was only so much research on this theory so far. So something about this is, even though there were theories like this already, but bits and pieces along these lines. But so something that Briffault fills in beautifully is that he starts with this whole thing of Christian marriage is a little odd. It's a great way of starting, kind of from in a way, that Christian marriage is actually this kind of oddity of history that, and he makes this great argument of how various Christians, in really attempting to expand Christianity to people outside of it, then made this argument, oh no, you see, so anytime you saw a coupling that was like the marriage in the West, in like the 1800s, things like that, maybe late 1600s, anytime you saw such behaviors, it would be like, oh, see, it's just like us, because this is this universal truth that and it's just been forgotten by the various nations, as it says in blah 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 blah, in the book of blah blah blah, and so that book of blah blah blah. So the thing that ends up coming to this that ends up being really important is he delves into so many things that are the foundation of feminist thinking, and the history. It's a beautiful book. It's absolutely beautiful. And so one of the things that you come away with as like some MGTOW red-pilled man, things like that, is okay, that's just how women, that's what they do. And really, the balance of things in this way is then why things kind of come into harmony, and society like lives and survives. It's like, oh, okay, it makes sense. Now, this is really important. Ladies, you bred men to think this. Our recent ancestors bred the men of the West to go through this process of, okay, it's not that the women are really doing some wild and crazy choice to do this and that. This actually seems to be something that is triggered by various conditions, and it catches on throughout the human group that you see it in. And Briffault's approach to this was wonderful, because it was so very dry. But he really got into this idea that he's like, no, human groups were too small for this kind of coupling in most situations. We have lots of evidence of all these various societies that we want in the West to believe had this atomic family structure that they didn't have. And then we have lots of documentation on it, that because they wrote down their own marriage records and their own birth records and things like that. There's language, that it survives in language. So Briffault really offered this idea of like, well, no, Americans and Britons and the Catholic nations, they're thinking of this all wrong. They're trying to impose some kind of Levitical concept onto nations that it's like, no, but they don't do that at all. Because it opened up then things that we found distasteful, such as how common polygamy was, that this was just the norm of all societies, and hardcore slavery. So that slavery and polygamy is actually the default of the human race. And that the Christians are this odd group that by force make people stop that. Which I found kind of fascinating. When I like walked through it, I'm like, well, shoot, huh. Okay. And because he has more socialist leanings. He doesn't really say this, but it just comes out in this dry way that he presents it. And so as time's gone on, I had to start thinking about, okay, we need to kind of stop this idea that, oh, there's this movement of the women doing all these things to mess it. No. This is really a kind of thing of that there's no civil society is kind of a veil over something else that's deeper, that's happening, that has to do with reproduction and the moving around of resources. Now, what's interesting is what then somebody like Dutton argues, because Dutton is arguing also that what we're seeing is the result of people who've mutated to become the rapacious upon such a system, and that they'll eat away at the society, and that and so one of the things he would argue is especially the uglies and fatties and stuff like that. They're starting movements to praise uglies and fatties because they want you to just pay them to exist. They're just literally, they're trying to guilt you in some weird way through the whole way that women deal with power, which is a lot of negotiation of how the group can take care of everybody. Well, they're trying to abuse that. They're doing a Mean Girls thing as ugly fatties. And now more and more beautiful women are starting to realize, like, wait, I'm the prize here, in society. So, no, that's not going to happen anymore. So that's, and right, people who are leaning to the right tend to be better looking people. And it has to do with the lack of what Dutton refers to as the mutational load, and the evidence of mutational load, where you have asymmetry, kind of inability to process what are relatively normal foods to their recent ancestors, or to people who are actually genetically similar to them, allergies to a lot of odd things in their environment, that you're starting to see, the various kind of mental conditions of sorts. These indicate these various. You start to see these mutations come out as you have more and more people not die early in childhood, or kind of these mutations would naturally cost them in a world that there wasn't, clean water, that there wasn't sewage in. People would do weird things that would cost them their lives, because they don't really kind of think quite the same way as other people. So it's it's now so a lot of women have to get this idea of, it's not your fault you're into feminism and witchcraft and you're kind of a hoe. It's not exactly your fault. It's that you're defaulting back to a pre-civilized setting. that you have to get the best raider that you could find, and now and then this gets mapped out. People talk about the alpha bro, and that the Tate future that's coming and things like that. But I really want to get, because it's not really a fault thing. This is the hard part about it, is this actually should kind of come a bit naturally. You naturally want this guy who's superhero in size on the dating apps, but you want a choice of which superhero you could choose from. And him being very, very agreeable would really help too, and a dog and a truck, would really help. Um, and so it's not really your fault that you would want this person who shows all the signs of being very able to make your life very, very, very safe and livable. That's why there's a stage at which for a lot of men there's a past anger thing. It's like, no, I get it. That evolutionarily it makes perfect sense. Now, also, one of the things that's hit a lot of guys is there's more and more indicators, and it's really through behaviors and sort of things that, like, people, okay, so everyone likes doing this thing of, oh, men tell their friends this, that, and this, and it's like, and then you're sitting there and you're like, no, none of my homies never told me anything like that. But you kind of have a hard time communicating the crazy story about the crazy shit some crazy bitch did that your homie told you about, because you kind of have a hard time believing it happened. And the beautiful part about cell phones now and all these websites is now people could turn their phone on. They're like, no, she did this. This chick really did this. And back in the day, you'd have a homeboy who would tell you something. You'd be like, that's too crazy. Like, that's just too out there, bro. Like, come on, And then this lady did what with her car? Come on, bro. But then now we see this. And so the thing is, society is now having to deal with, wait, is there something now happening? Because the men still appear shocked. The women aren't choosing the men. So this really starts coming down to, it doesn't appear, and then there's men haven't changed their voting patterns over about the last 100 years that much, and women have. So this is a massive set of change that we've seen in women since really the onset of feminism and the introduction of organized Marxism to academia and the middle class and sort of the intelligentsia, the public intellectuals of the Western world, and that this is now this constant argument on Marxist policies, really versus just not having a group of outside experts fiddle-faddle with whatever, the Marxists want to fiddle-faddle with. If showing itself in different forms where you would then have, just a form of collective that people just want to come up with a collective. And now you got to go to them. To mow your lawn, you got to talk to this collective, and that you start to find, this seems to be an actual personality type that then shows up in policy. And that when you look into groups of people in history, parts of the country, that are more likely to have this kind of thing, you actually could find patterns of this that'll go back a long way. And in very specific parts of the country, among certain kinds of people, you will find this less among the Scots-Irish, but you'll find it a lot among people of English descent. Certain descents from Scandinavia will be really into having lots and lots and lots of collectives, regulatory boards that you have to check if you can mow your lawn that day. And, or today you have to cut it with scissors or something, and if do you have to wear galoshes or can you just wear boots? And so, as don't worry, there's an expert who told us it's important for the environment whether you wear boots or whether you wear galoshes. Don't question experts. Or you're going to run into problems, buddy. And so, a lot of ladies have to kind of get this idea of like, no, we're finding out this is actually kind of relatively normal. This is really something that's kind of evolutionary in its basis. It's also something that, because it's evolutionary in its basis, it's like, where does it apply kind of culturally? A lot of the first wave of feminism absolutely can be attributed to Yankees of North or of New England descent. It doesn't spread terribly far outside of that by the second generation. The third generation, it explodes everywhere as it becomes a standard of most universities, and really expands, especially during the 70s with the onset of things like Wicca and witchcraft is like a movement, as you start to get these like occultist groups and like their old books become available. They kind of need new generations of people involved, and they got popular in the 70s. Like, people really forget, like, America became a weird swinging place in the 70s, and like, yeah, like it's pretty weird. Like, one of the things actually somebody might be because I just found it interesting, because it was a young lady who this reminded me of, was if you look up Gurdjieff dance, and it's this one occultist, and he had this sort of ideology of that people would set themselves into harmony with the universe and heal by doing these group dances, and it's pretty weird stuff. It's pretty fun to see, and that's the 70s. That's our world during the 70s, and so so a lot of women, you shouldn't really feel bad about, like, I'm not doing it, I know what I want. And it's like, okay, now you need to understand what you want to some degree was dictated by a bunch of these kind of crystal worshipping old hippie witches of the 1950s. It's almost completely white in descent. I mean, there's almost nothing more white than feminism and Marxism and socialism and progressivism. And keep in mind that this is also linked inherently to then the progressive movement. And no one wants to deal with the progressive movement's history, because that was the specifically the movement that introduced the idea of maybe we should just start whittling down the herd. And, and this seems to be something that people are finding. Well, it's weird. It seems as if women nowadays are very comfortable with that idea. It seems like that, and more, yeah, and that's really why, like, a lot of you are going to have some troubles with a lot of people in society, because you don't really get that your ideas are fundamentally kind of this weird form of occultist fascism. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's hard to that's hard to mesh with a lot of other thinking. So yeah. All right. Well, have a good one.